Good afternoon, and welcome to Whatcom County Flooding, Reflecting on Community Resiliency. My name is Karen Achiagrasso, and I am a board member here at the Whatcom Community Foundation. As a longtime community resident, it was truly humbling to watch our community, this community, come together in this time of extreme crisis. One of the things that really struck me, and I'm sure it struck most of you, was the organic nature of the response. People just jumping in, and what can I do with the resources that I have? Neighbors helping neighbors, strangers helping neighbors, strangers helping new friends, colleagues helping colleagues. It was truly amazing to watch. I wanted to be certain and express our gratitude to every single Resilience Fund donor, to the long-term recovery group, and every single volunteer in our faith community. Ultimately, local philanthropic support will always be the fastest and most flexible funding mechanism available after a disaster. Those displaced by flooding will need long-term case management and support to rebuild or locate. We're happy you could all join us today to learn more about our community and how our neighbors are recovering. I'd like to introduce Mauri Ingram, President and CEO of our Whatcom Community Foundation. Mauri?
Thank you, Karen, and welcome everybody. Thanks for joining us today. Before we get started, I want to share a few housekeeping items. We will have a Q&A following the panel discussion, and we would really appreciate it if you would post your questions in the Q&A function, and that will help us a bit on the back end. The presentation is being recorded, and we will send out a link to the recording as well as the slide deck after the presentation. On behalf of the board and staff of the Community Foundation, I want to express our appreciation for the gift of residing and operating on the traditional, ancestral, and unceded lands of the Lange, Nooksack, and other Coast Salish peoples as the area's original inhabitants. Since time immemorial, Coast Salish people have lived in villages throughout this territory, practicing their way of life on the land and waterways. We honor their ancestors as we acknowledge the past, present, and future of all Coast Salish peoples and express gratitude for their generosity in sharing the land and waterways, as well as their knowledge, ways, and friendship with all who came later. A little bit of background for the series. This briefing series actually began last fall in an effort to raise awareness and deepen understanding of pressing community issues and give all of us as individuals, organizations, and a community ways to take action to address them. The first briefing focused on youth mental health. If you missed it, you'll find the link to the recording and resources on the events page on our website. Now a little bit about what to expect, what the briefing is and what it isn't. It is truly a small slice of a very large and complex topic. We're really going to focus today on the human impacts, and we're going to speak with a small handful of very important people, but people who are among a much larger group of other nonprofits and school districts, local, state, and federal government staff and electeds, and of course, flood survivors themselves. And finally, we're going to be looking at both lessons learned and areas of improvement and things that you can do to help going forward. It's important because much of what you will hear today will be hard to hear, to start by taking a little time to celebrate. There are so many examples, as I'm sure many of you are aware, of neighbors stepping forward to help each other. Farmers literally rescuing people with their tractors and front loaders, members of the Sikh community preparing hot meals for survivors, a group coming together to form Whatcom Strong out of whole cloth to become an organized flood relief effort, individuals, community groups, businesses, foundations, and churches making contributions to the Resilience Fund ranging from $10,000 to $100,000. And thanks to that generosity, The Community Foundation has been able to distribute almost $2.2 million to a host of community partners, including the organizations that you'll hear from today, as well as several churches in the hardest hit parts of the county. Some of those churches, their pastors and parishioners also suffered significant damage from the flooding, and yet did not let that hamper their efforts to help their neighbors. And with regard to impacts, this is just a tiny set of examples of some of the issues that were already present pre-COVID and pre-flood and have been worsened. And so it's a really important way for us to acknowledge the fortitude and perseverance of those whose lives remain completely upended by the flooding as they strive to keep their families fed, in safe, stable housing, keep their kids in the schools that they attended pre-flood, and everyone in their household getting the support they need after having endured traumatic experiences, all while trying to figure out how to rebuild their lives. Before we hear from our panel, I want to circle back to Whatcom Strong, which has now become a nonprofit organization and has been renamed the Whatcom Long-Term Recovery Group, or LTRG for short. And as you can see from this graphic, the group plays multiple roles in disaster recovery. And while that's true in the flood recovery at this time, it will also be true in the future because the group will be around over the long term to help with the next disaster whenever that happens. We are incredibly grateful to have 4 panelists with us today. We have Liz Baxter, the CEO of the North Sound Accountable Community of Health, Lacey Lange, who's the lead disaster case manager for the Whatcom Long-Term Recovery Group, Sylvia Mendoza, the family liaison for the Nooksack Valley School District, and Will Rice, who is the agency director for Catholic Community Services of Western Washington. And I want to start with just a little lightning round. This is the 6-month anniversary of the flooding, and I want to ask each of you just to share one word that reflects that last 6 months for you. You can hyphenate if you'd like, but no explanation beyond that. And Liz, I think I'll start with you.
Dang, I didn't know I could do the hyphenating. My word is illuminating.
Sylvia, how about you?
Sorry about that, Mauri. My word is transformation.
Thank you. Lacey?
My word is powerful.
And Will?
Difficult.
Thank you. So to start, for many people, we know that life essentially returned to normal after the floodwaters receded, and yet for others, life continues to be filled with new struggles and a lot of uncertainty. So we want to find out what you want people to know about life 6 months after the flooding for those that are still in crisis and recovery mode. Sylvia, can I ask you to get us started?
Excuse me. I guess one of the things I would like to say is that, we're still in recovery mode. It's very much, we're still trying to, many families are still in hotels. Some families are now moving into a little bit more about permanent housing, and they're still recovering. They're still recovering from impact, from trauma, from just change. And so I think it's going to be a little bit longer before they are fully recovered, or maybe not at all recovered. And so I think some of the things that we need to be, excuse me, as a school district, just empathetic and be patient and willing to support our families in every moment we can to ease that recovery as much as possible.
Thank you. Lacey, how about you?
I echo Sylvia's sentiments about the flood survivors are still in trauma, and that's going to continue for years to come. I also want people to know that flood survivors still need an immense amount of support in their recovery. Many still need shoes, all the way up to needing houses. And so it's a big, wide, open that we have for the needs that we're trying to fill. But mostly I just want people to know that this isn't going to be done, in the next 6 months, that this is going to still take years to recover from. And that's just not for the trauma piece, but just also financially, holistically, basically, to recover.
Well,
Sure. I want to reflect just for a second here on something, and I think it might have been a conversation I was actually having with Lacey and some of our team up in Sumas. We got together and had a little debriefing lunch. And Lacey said something about what happens when the TV cameras go away. That there was a lot of attention right after the flood, and then there was a second flood, and it was in the news, it was in the ether for a handful of months, and there was a lot of outpouring. But then the TV cameras went away, I think there's a need to keep the spotlight on the disaster. That might not be intuitive, but that we have to keep the light on it, that it is going to take significant amount of time. And there's another thing, just to make a pitch for, in the human service world, there's a movement called trauma-informed care that's occurring. And this is a really great time for Whatcom County to become familiar with what it means to become trauma-informed, which in the shortest way to explain it is, rather than seeing a family or person and saying, what's wrong with you, you reframe it to say, what happened to you? And that to me is kind of the calling moving forward. As the TV cameras are gone, the apparent outside physical signs of the disaster might be a little harder to see, to remember that trauma is not something that's visible, and that we have to have an approach to keep the light on the folks that need our attention.
absolutely. Thanks, Will. Liz?
Yeah, and I appreciate all of the comments so far. So when I think about where we are, I think about just how we honor people who stepped in to help, and how we're not fooling ourselves that we don't have a lot of flaws in our kind of response system. So for me, it's, in the immediacy of the crisis, people came from near and far. I mean, people came from hundreds of miles away to step in, and people helped their neighbors. But still, here we are in May, and people are still being identified who were flood impacted that have not emerged before. And just understanding what that means, without blaming them for not stepping up, but just realizing that there's not like one definition of what it meant to be impacted by this flooding. That kind of the impacts of poverty, housing insecurity, COVID exacerbated how flooding impacted communities, that people were already being kind of battered and battling different things. The flooding took kind of the proverbial legs out from any progress that some communities had been making. And, they when they get to the point of whatever this recovery is, they're still going to be behind, because whatever progress they've been making had been severely impacted. And so when I think about this kind of recurring theme of trauma, it's just thinking about this as cumulative, like this is cumulative trauma that individuals and families have been facing. And so not everybody had the same impacts, and not everybody has the same path to recovery. And so how we can be creative along the way. And then just like two kind of overarching things for me, I would want everyone to know that there are people who live in Whatcom County where English is not their first language or their preferred language. There are people who were born here in Whatcom County that need us to be speaking and sharing information and gathering information in multiple languages. That doesn't mean that they are a visitor. They are long-term residents, and we just need to understand that our community and our county is changing. And then I'll close with, I would want folks to know that we can have gratitude and still voice the things that need to improve. that's not blaming, but it's looking for opportunities and innovation. And if we're not willing to hear those, you know, that's tough, because there are a lot of things that we learned in the last 6 months and in the last 2 years and years before that, that I'm hoping we take what we learned and do something better with them looking forward.
Thank you. And I think it's helpful to point out that a lot of the conversations that happen among these organizations, as well as many others, are really trying to look inwardly at what we can do individually better as organizations, and then what we can do better together, and where we need changes as a community. And we can come back to that in a bit. So that's also a great segue into the next question. As you all know, we all make assumptions about situations. We base it on the information we have and what we see in front of us. And sometimes we share those with others, and they over time become ingrained as beliefs, but they may not be accurate. And so would love to hear from each of you what some of those assumptions that you might have heard about flood-related issues that may not be accurate. And Will, how about we start with you this time?
Sure, and this is my thoughts on this. You know, it pertains for sure to our North County flooding disaster, but I think it also happens in other disasters that I've been loosely associated to with response to, and that is the assumption that people chose to live there. And it's an ugly fallout shadow of disaster work where there's some victim blaming, that people chose to live in the floodplain. So what did they expect? Yeah, we finally had the big flood. Everyone knew it was coming. And somehow this was the people's responsibility that lived there to be better prepared. And that couldn't be more hurtful and just wrong. And I think we could all look at different points in our lives where it looked like we made a choice, but you know, life kind of chose where we lived or what our job was, or you know, who your friend was or who your neighbor was. Those weren't necessarily, you know, choices. A lot of folks ended up living where they ended up living because that's where, you know, life took them. And so I think we really need to check our assumptions about why people were living where they were living, and they're not to blame for being a victim of a flood.
Mauri, did you say I could go next? I'm sorry about that.
Yes.
I wasn't hearing. Sorry about that. I think one of the things that Will shared, or I think it was Will, about being in the spotlight, the cameras, right? And I think the assumption is that because we're not in the spotlight, maybe we're okay. We're okay now, and things are recovering and things are getting better, where things are really not. There's still a lot of work in progress, and we need to sort of work with that. And there's a lot of families that have been affected. Another assumption that I was thinking of is sometimes the assumption of, I serve a great Latino population, and the assumption that because we hand them out a paper and we give them that information, that they're going to be able to read it, understand it, and follow through with that, where that is not always the case. A lot of our families need that extra support and that extra sort of guidance, sometimes step-by-step guidance, sometimes a lot of clarity and a lot of clear conversations to understand what they need to do in order to access services, or in order to access the things that they need in order to help them with this process of being flood victims.
Liz, how about you?
Did you say Liz? Okay. You know, in terms of assumptions, you know, I mean, we all make assumptions, so I'm just gonna like own up. I make assumptions. We all make assumptions. I think that some of the assumptions we were looking for people who got displaced from housing. Like how housing became like the anchor and the equivalent of being flood impacted. Were you pushed out of an apartment? Were you pushed out of a home? And so trying to track people by like a single permanent address became like this huge body of work. And we had a hard time thinking about other people who might not be secure in a housing location as being flood impacted. We were always trying to like connect those dots in some way. I think that we always assume that if we build something, people will come. You know, we build a call center, people will call. We put something online, people will see it. And that if they don't, it means they chose not to. And we forget that sometimes people don't know if something happens to where they're living, that the county is a place that they should call. I mean, I just like those basic things. I would never have thought to call the county if something happened, you know, to my house. And I might not see the things that get posted online, et cetera. And again, just some of the language barriers I think are kind of in there. You know, I think the other thing is we assume good intention because I think everyone who stepped in did amazing, heroic things. But I think we also assume that in the middle of a crisis, structural barriers, systemic racism, that like somehow those things magically disappear when we're in the middle of a crisis. And that we just like, we all do kind of a big kumbaya kind of moment because we're helping people to get out of standing water, to move out of flood and mud. But when we stand up our system, those things make a difference for who we think are worthy of help and not worthy of help. And so the assumption that every person who was flood impacted had access to the same level of resources is an assumption that I think many people had, and I'm not sure that it actually holds true. I'm going to hand it to Lacey. Lacey, you go next.
Yeah, I think it's my turn. So some of the assumptions that I have seen and heard is that, oh, it's just a small town. It's a small town with small needs. And, you know, and also one of those being, you know, living here in our small communities, we just take care of ourselves, you know, and that's where you saw the farmers coming out at the beginning. You saw Whatcom Strong, you know, forming of the local leaders and volunteers just to come together. And then, you know, eventually we've now led us to the Whatcom Long-Term Recovery Group. But in that small town and these smaller communities, we still have big needs. And I feel like that's overlooked so much because we aren't good at self-advocating for us in these smaller towns. And we rely on, you know, the bigger fish in the bigger cities to see us and hear us. And so I just, that's a huge assumption that I just know exists. And it interferes with our ability to get the meat to fill the needs of the flood survivors. It really, I feel like, is a barrier for us as we're trying to work with the flood victims. And I think the more that we can advocate for our communities, it's necessary, but I feel like it even needs to go broader than that, of just getting that information out there. I also feel like one of the assumptions is that we are not a diverse community. And we are so much more diverse than I think people realize. And I think we as community members, it is our, you know, our plight or our, you know, our job to elevate the needs of everyone in our community. And it's not just, you know, the four of us here on this screen. It's more, it needs to be a community response and valuing and creating that, just that equity across all communities that are in this area.
So Lacey, you actually made me think of something that I would imagine we'd all agree. And it is, one assumption is people think that the flood impact is in the past.
Oh, yeah.
And
Yeah.
and don't understand like the current impact from what happened back then.
Yeah.
Just you kind of triggered that in my head.
And I would agree with that wholeheartedly.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay, all right. Let's do this quickly while I've got audio. So we know that there's improvement. We've touched on it a bit, both for each of our organizations and then for larger systems that impact the community. And I'm wondering what each of you might share around what you think are some of the next conversations that we need to have and actions that we need to take either as a community or within your own organization to improve response efforts for the next go round. And Sylvia, could you get us started?
I keep talking over my mute microphone. Sorry about that. You know, this is a hard question because, you know, I'm not exactly sure what actions we need to take. I just need to, I think one thing I could say is that we need to collaborate more. We need to be proactive. We need to be thinking of, I think families are thinking of the next flood. Families are thinking what happens, what's going to happen when November comes? How do we as an agencies and school districts and community prepare ourselves for what if something is going to happen in November? I think the families have fear. Our Latino families don't know what's going to happen. You know, they're in fear of losing the only things they have. I think that's just, you know, I think some families are impacted by trauma. They're impacted by, you know, mental health regarding those experiences. And so I don't know. I think that that is a very hard question for me to answer. It's just like, how do we continue to support our families and meet them where they're at? How do we continue to support our families and meet them with the needs that they need now, right? But that also, how do we educate them and prepare them for, those are questions that I have, right? How do we educate them and prepare them for when another impact like this happens?
So the next conversations that I feel need to happen are just continued conversations with all of the community partners and the partnership with the EOC. And really, you know, we know the flood is coming. You know, Sylvia, you said if the flood is coming, I think it's more about when the flood comes. You know, fall is right around the corner. And I think as, you know, the Whatcom long-term recovery group, it's not just for this flood disaster, it is for all future disasters. And so I'm proud that we have this organization that will be here for the long haul, but also know that there's a lot of conversations that need to continue to happen routinely, not just in the moment and not just right before a flood, of how we respond during the flooding. You know, what is the state's role? What is the county role during these moments of disaster here? Because they're going to continue because that's the floods aren't going anywhere anytime soon. And so that's just one of the conversations that I think, you know, it's exciting that we've built so many connections amongst the community partners. And so I feel like we're well on our way, but there's still so much work and growth that we could reach prior to the next event.
Liz, how about you?
Well, I feel like this is where like I live my morning, noons, and nights, but I think that the next time is actually before the fall. So, you know, I've only been in Whatcom County for 6 years. 3 of those summers have been spent blanketed in the month of August by smoke from Canadian wildfires. I think of the heat that occurs in the summer that has taken the lives of farm workers. And all of those are crises. And so for me, it's knowing that the impacts are really, really local, but the resources aren't always local. So there's this local, county, state, federal, et cetera. And how we leverage resources going in both directions is going to be critical for whatever is the next crisis. And, you know, so one of the things the ACH has been doing, trying to kind of nurture and feed this relationship building and knowledge sharing, you know, across multiple organizations, so that we know who to call on, like who's doing what and who could do more if they had resources to do more. Just like, what's that capacity across the region? I know that county lines are really, really important. And it's typically the federal dollars go from to the nation, to the state, to the counties, but people don't live in counties. I mean, it just has been really, like, that's why illuminating for me is if somebody was living in Whatcom County, but they went to live with somebody in Skagit couldn't help them because they'd be looking for an address in Whatcom County and they'd send somebody back to Whatcom County. And so, like, how we can blur these jurisdictional lines that are critical in some ways and absolutely invisible to most community members in other ways. They just don't think of themselves as being tied to counties. They think of themselves as being tied to communities and neighborhoods. And the county is like that thing you pay attention to if you have to pay taxes or something like that. And then, you know, again, and I know I'm going to sound like I'm beating this drum, but like how equity becomes one of the grounding tenets of whatever our response efforts are is critical. And so how we build relationships so that people who are most impacted like get to be at the table and making decisions about how we design, how we respond the next time is really critical. And we know a lot, so we should do better at that. And, you know, just how we think about what defines a community. Because again, in the middle of a disaster, everything's local. But that local is really different. You know, we can think about the fact that the federal government declared Whatcom County as a disaster area. But what happened in the north and east part of the county would look really different if we were talking about Lake Whatcom, or we were talking about Lake Padden, or we were talking about someplace else. The folks who get drawn to things care about the place that they live. And we just have to figure out ways to create those kind of connected communities for whatever it is that's coming next. And I'm kind of excited, you know, at some of the things we've learned, but there's a lot that we could do better. So I'll probably pause there.
Thank you. Will?
Yeah, I'm going to kind of follow up a bit on Liz's theme about funding and ability to respond. One of the things that was both the most encouraging thing, and it's actually going to be a bit of part of my story when I get to in the next part, to talk about how the Community Foundation operated in, you know, in the moment on, you know, November 17th, you know, how the philanthropy community stood up and said, okay, we have to do something here because there's no one else to do anything. And it's not to say that the county wasn't doing something. There was a lot of rescue going on. There was a lot of things going on. But when it came to how are these people that just got displaced going to eat today? Because they lost everything. They don't have any money. And we started talking about getting gift cards out to people that were in the emergency shelter so they could, you know, get a pair of shoes because they lost their shoes. This is going to sound a bit like a crack or a joke, but it's not. But, you know, there's a term called rainy day fund. And I think that term comes from saving money for floods. That was the rainy day. And that I do believe we need to have a conversation with the county around having a rainy day fund that is non-dedicated money that has flexibility to be used in a crisis in the first response. because to me, that was one of the glaring, again, beautiful moments of watching the foundation stand up, but really the inability of local government to stand up and help in some of the things that had to happen on the 17th, on the 18th, the 19th, the 20th, the weekend. I mean, that it was really, the strings that were tied around the funds that could be used from government were overbearing and rendered them unusable. And so the rest of the community had to do what they had to do. And I think we need to talk about that. And I think and Whatcom County's not in, you look at all disasters and there are these types of analysis that have to happen afterwards around the inability sometimes of local government, which might mean being a part of a network of disaster response communities. So other communities, because like Liz is saying, if this was, and I'm not minimizing this at all, but if this was, took out the seat of Whatcom County and didn't have the sheriffs to be able to respond, who would we have turned to then? And there are organizations, volunteer disaster organizations of communities that link together. So if a disaster does hit and renders a community unable to respond, there are other folks that can come in. And I was very involved in the Oso disaster up in Darrington, Arlington a few years back. And they made use of that because their community really was disabled. And so they had to have folks come in from the outside. And I think we need to have a conversation about what that would look like for Whatcom County.
Great. Well, as you noted, Will, we asked you to think about some stories. We know that there's a lot of data that gets thrown around in disasters, partly because in order to unleash some of that funding, people need to know how many folks were displaced, how many homes need to be bought out. And yet, I think all of you know better than most that it's really the stories that help us understand what the real needs are and where we need to change and improve. And so I want to ask each of you to just share a story either that's worth celebrating or one that needs to be heard that relates to your work in the flood. And so Will, since you got us started with a teaser, we'll start with you.
Sure. And I want to do this because I do also want to acknowledge the humble nature of the Whatcom Community Foundation and that they're not going to tell this story. So I want to tell this story. And it's really the story of Pamela, John, and Mauri on November 17th. And I think it was like a Monday or Tuesday, the flood had happened. Everyone was scrambling and I got a phone call. I think from Pamela or an email saying, we know everyone's heart is just being torn out by what's happening in North County. Can we talk about what you're thinking or what you're able to do? And immediately I responded back, of course. And we had worked together around, the COVID response in the early days of the shutdown and some other things having to do with some families impacted by immigration raids and some other things. So we had worked together in the moment around some immediate things, but the word I want to use is there was a gracefulness that occurred between the Community Foundation and Catholic Community Services and I need to say, and Lowe's Hardware and Home Depot and every place we called, because what happened was we got, can you help? Yeah, we can help. What about gift cards? And it was like, hey, I got a couple $1,000s of gift cards I could repurpose right today. Great, can we go buy some more? Yes, I'll send you money. And so it really became a sense of what's needed, can you do it? And it became, we need plastic bins. Families need plastic bins. Everything's getting wet. They can save stuff if they have plastic bins. So, and this is a huge shout out to Kelly Siegel and Ruth May Plumbo and Andrea Cunningham, who were the original. They had Lacey working in this, unbeknownst to me, on the side up there, talking with everybody around what was needed. And Andrea, who's my get it done person in all things, started calling Home Depot and Bellingham and Lowe's, emptied them out of every plastic bin we could buy, went down to Burlington, bought them up there, went to Everett, bought them up there. It then became, we need box fans. Box fans are needed because, you know, if we could dry it out, we could maybe save some of the drywall. And so it became a mad scurry of, let's call Lowe's and Home Depot and get box fans. And we ended up, I think, with the box fans, getting them to deliver them. And so it was how you would, if you were to, in your mind's eye, picture how a disaster response would work, this is how it worked. It was like, what do you need? We need this. We got the money. Can you go buy it? Yes, we can buy it. How do we get it there? I don't know. Let's figure out how we can get it there. And it was a ballet. It was an absolute ballet that went on for a couple weeks of stuff. And I know stuff was showing up at Sumas and then it would show up in Nooksack and coordinating that stuff. But I just wanted to paint that picture, and that the Community Foundation was in the middle of it. And in the middle of it with great trust of everyone that was operating, to just really, to write the check, to get the stuff bought. And so that was really a moment of celebration, sitting back after the first couple of weeks, knowing there was such a long road ahead. But those first few days, we did it as right as we could do it. And I'm sure it wasn't enough. There wasn't enough box fans. There wasn't enough plastic totes, but we literally bought them out from Everett North. But to see that response happen and to hear the stories back from Ruth May and Lacey on the ground when the truck would show up, and that, you know, people were like, yes, the truck's here. That was very heartwarming to be able to see the community operate like that. So that's a long way of saying, Mauri and Pamela, you two and the whole team at the foundation are just awesome.
Very much. It was truly a team effort. We're grateful to play that role. Sylvia, how about you?
I was hoping I would go last, but that's okay. Just kidding. You know, I just thinking about what Will was sharing. I mean, I've got many stories. I mean, I think we all have a lot of stories. We have some sad stories, some stories that have caused compassion fatigue. That's a word that sometimes, you know, we tend to use a lot when we serve families and we serve communities. And so, but I don't want to focus on some of those. I want to focus on how quickly our school responded. I feel like I in the work that I do, I have a lot of relationships with families and a lot of trust with families. And I remember the first call that a couple families gave to me, you know, early in the morning when the flood was happening. And to tell you the truth, I didn't know where to send them. They were calling me for answers and I didn't have the answers. I started calling the schools. I started calling, you know, our administrators and trying to figure out where do we put these families? Where do we place them? Where can they go? They felt trapped. And I'm sorry, I get a little emotional with this, but we ended up sending them to the 2 buildings in our schools. And people were there and I couldn't get out of my own house because we were trapped also. And so I'm on the phone all the time trying to guide these families where to go. And our school stepped up to support our families, to be there for them, to give them shelter, to give them comfort, to give them that trust that they needed. And it was amazing to see just how our schools and our teachers and our school staff responded to the families. It was very amazing. And I will just forever be grateful for that. And that's my story.
Thank you, Sylvia. Lacey, what would you share?
I too, like Sylvia, get very emotional when sharing the stories of so many. And I've really debated about how best to answer this question because, you know, there are so many celebrations, you know, from the beginning you know, I looked around and I literally was like, I think this is what angels look like, because there was just so many people that just came to help. And you know, and those, it was such a moment of gratitude at that time. And it's definitely, you know, that continues, but there are so many stories of sadness that I think still need to be brought out to light. So I apologize that this isn't necessarily a celebratory story, but and it's this it's going to be generalized because there are so many that are in this situation. Is that, you know, we have so many families that are still living in their homes that were flooded, and now people could make their own assumptions of why this has happened and why it's occurring. But honestly, this is what they feel is best for their family. And I ask that everyone respects that. But for whatever reasons, whether it's financial, you know, trauma, you know, that fight or flee, fight or flee, flight or fight, oh, you'll get it eventually. You know, that it all compounds to where these families are. So specifically, we have a family in Sumas that has chosen to stay in their home, and they're getting sick because of the amount of mold in these homes and in their homes specifically. You know, they're not one to ask for help, although we're trying to help and help them get avenues. And then, you know, you get a blow like, okay, we're going to get their crawl space cleaned out. Well, you know what? They're not eligible for a crawl space clean out because of how their house was made. And so it's like, you think you're making some progress with these families, and then it's another gut punch. And as a disaster case manager, not only is it a gut punch to me, but it's an even larger gut punch to the families. Like, we think we're finally making some headway in their progress of their recovery, and it's not happening like we had envisioned. And so I want people to remember that, you know, there are still families that are, they're still struggling. I guess I just will put it that way. Like, if you could think of the worst case scenario in a flood situation, that worst case scenario still is happening. And I would like to say at no fault of their own. You know, they're doing truly the best that they can. I'll leave it at that.
Thank you. It's important that we're seeing all sides of the issue. So the celebration is great, but it's only meaningful in the context of the other end of the spectrum. So, Liz, about you.
I'm going to beg forgiveness to do two stories. The first one is about entree and access. And the other thing for everyone to remember, that during this immediacy of the flooding, we also had some really severe fluctuations in temperature. And so we went from the 40s to 6 to 25. I mean, like, there were just so many things that were happening. And I got a call from probably Rosalinda, is my guess, asking about whether there would be a warming center stood up in Maple Falls as the temperature was plummeting. And I said, like, that's not my wheelhouse, but let me make some calls. And called the county and the EOC, and they said, you know, that's not their thing. And I just happened to have the phone number for the spouse of our community action director. And I just started like harassing them by like, who do I call? And, you know, Greg Winter was amazing, and, you know, talked to the folks in Maple Falls, and they were able to open the center knowing that they couldn't get to it because the snow was like so heavy. So they had to like pull on staff. And the next morning, like, people were able to get in there, but I also heard back that there were people who slept at the fire station because the fire station opened their doors. And I just think like that's really pretty incredible. But we didn't actually have a strategy around it. We just knew some folks that we all like can pull tendrils of who to call to try and make something happen. I'd like to think we can be more systematic than that. But, you know, at the heart of it, it's about trust. And, you know, I think it's been brought up a couple of times, but there were organizations that trusted some organizations to reach out to, and they didn't trust others, you know, and for whatever those reasons were. So our team, when we would get a call saying, hey, can you help this family, you know, get into a hotel room, you know, and I think really mirroring some of Lacey's comments, we didn't ask why were they calling us. We just tried to help. And the fact that we could say yes and work with C2C and others, just, you know, we would end the day just going like, what an amazing gift we have that those organizations trusted us to step in and help in those scenarios. And at the end of the day, I'm going to say this was probably in March or so, we realized that there were families staying in the hotels who had all of our phone numbers. And, you know, because probably like many of you, I think my credit card was sitting at 5 hotels, and, you know, we're close to like probably about $100,000 of hotel space. But I get a phone call and it's from an unidentified number. And the message is, my son passed away. And I have to reach out to my team because I said, like, I'm not going to call somebody back and go like, who is this? And then she followed up and she left a text for me. And it ended up that it was someone that had been staying in the hotel. I happened to have been the first person that somehow she got a phone number for, because my number was connected to the credit card. And we had what I would just call a text relationship for about 7 or 8 weeks while she and her son were in the hotel. And it isn't that I was the case manager. Like, I'm not sure I did anything except I was another person she could text. And I would say like, oh yeah, you should check with so-and-so. And oh yeah, like, how are things going? But the notion that she reached out to us, she was actually out of the hotels to let us know that her son passed away, and how our team, and I'm sure others, responded to her. Like how much what happened during that period of time connected to people and their humanity, and how we respond as human beings during that period of time is really critical. It's way more than I left you a frozen meal, or, you know, I left a bag outside your door. When people are in crisis, they want a human connection. And I just think that at the heart of what everyone has done, it is how do we remember that these are human beings who have been traumatized and displaced, and they have emotional and spiritual needs, and it's imperative that we respond in humankind. And I mean, I have no idea how she held on to my phone number and why she reached out to me, but, you know, we were then able to have another 2-ish weeks of, is there anything she needed? Like, how did, you know, just like, but those connections are really critical. And the fact that she trusted us enough to let us know that he had passed really stuck with me. And, you know, just real people experiencing real things, and they are part of us. They're part of the connectivity we have in community. Therefore, we should take good care of the people in our community.
Liz, that's the perfect way to punctuate. I'm going to turn it back over to Karen. And just so folks know, we do have some questions that were posted. So thank you for submitting those, and we will be back in just a few minutes if you can stick around. So Karen.
Liz, thank you so much. I am just struck by that last thing you said, where in crisis, everyone was searching and struggling for human connection. And I think every single person on this panel and every single person listening has been part of this human connection. Thank you. You may be asking yourselves, what can I do moving forward? There are several things you can do. You can prepare. Ask yourself, am I prepared? Is my home prepared? Is where I work prepared? The communities that I'm a part of, whether it's my faith group, where I live, are we prepared? you can give. Dollars work. You know, I hear y'all saying, you know, money on the ground, boots on the ground is what made this happen. We can't do it without your dollars. Whatcom Long-Term Recovery Group Fund, Resilience Fund are two really wonderful places. Volunteer. It's still there. We still need your help. Volunteer, participate, go to meetings, log on, go to county council, go to city councils, be heard, vote, share information. It's amazing how many things I see that aren't necessarily organic, but I see it shared from a credible source on somebody's social media that I also find credible. So share it, share it, share it. Connect, hear the information straight for the source. I would encourage you to sign up for the Thrive e-news through the Whatcom Community Foundation. There's so much wonderful information there, and follow all these wonderful organizations on social media. Thank you. Thank you everyone for coming, and we'll see you next time.
Thank you, Karen. And we did ask our panelists to stick around for a few minutes to answer some questions. So if you have to leave us now, again, as Karen said, thank you for joining us. We will include in the recording this follow-on period, so you don't have to miss anything. And with that, for those of you that have to leave us, thank you again. And I think we'll dig into some questions from our attendees. So first, and some folks touch on the impacts on immigrant communities a little bit. And the question is, how can immigrant communities affected by the flood get involved in decision-making regarding long-term recovery efforts and emergency response? And there, I want to first of all say that, as we noted earlier, we don't have anybody on from local, state, or federal government. And so there are definitely answers that will come from there as well. But I wanted to just open it up to see if any folks on the panel had any comment about planning efforts, organizational improvement efforts, those kinds of things that, that you see that people might be able to engage in.
I would like to start off by just saying, like, I think the Whatcom Long-Term Recovery Group, we are always looking for people to join any of our committees. And so reaching out through our website, whatcomstrong.com, has information about how people can get involved. And so that is just my first thought is if anybody from any type of community, any resource, we would love for people to continue to join our capacity of helping people.
I think I just wanted to add that for some of our immigrant communities, I think is being able to understand their needs and being able to hear them and hear their stories. That's important. And based on their stories, to really ask them, try to figure out where those gaps are. What are you needing? What are you missing? What are some of the things maybe that we need to do in order to better serve you? Sometimes going directly to the source is going to help us understand how we can support them in the best way possible. So hearing more stories.
Yeah. I was thinking, Sylvia, of, our discussions to try and do some type of a listening session out in Nooksack. I think it would be so helpful for us to learn what worked, what didn't work, where were we correct in our assumptions, where did we miss in our assumptions, and like how we can plan better and have those connections in the future. So I am hoping that we find a date soon, where we can get that meeting set up.
Yeah, no, that's just what I was going to say too, Liz, was, I think we're probably approaching a time where getting that beginning of the, examination of what needs to start happening, but it also needs to be done in a way that's safe and safe for those that responded and those impacted on both sides. So it's not a blaming of what went wrong, but really an honest appraisal of what is. There's a saying in disaster work, that disasters are always a disaster. And there is truth in that. But and that type of thinking has to be the thing that permeates the examination disasters are not something you do right. You do the best you can do and you learn. So the next time you do it, you might be just fractionally more right. But I think the time to do that's probably coming up pretty soon.
Great, thank you. And Liz, you mentioned a bit about some of the trust issues that were observed by some folks just feeling comfortable reaching out to some organizations and not to others. And we have a question about whether it was information or misinformation that flood victims didn't trust, in this case, specifically Bellingham-based organizations. So was that true? And if so, how can that be addressed?
I mean, I'm happy to start, and I just want to perhaps just re-echo what Will just said. It's not a reflection on the organizations as much as people's lived experience with a variety of things. You know, in Whatcom and in Skagit, the Emergency Operations Center, the Department of Emergency Management, you know, in Whatcom that sits in the Sheriff's Department, and so the notion of having a call center, people having information, not understanding what's going to happen with your information once you put your personal identifying information in the county system, that caused some folks to pause and not having clarity about, you know, will ICE have access to this information? Like, you know, once you get kind of further in, you know, and so how we can do things where, like, that's not, I'm not blaming the county for that. But if the county can understand, someone might be more willing to call a local or community-based organization to share their information than to call something affiliated with the sheriff's office. We just have to adjust for those types of situations and not try to necessarily help somebody feel like, no, you should trust the sheriff's office. It's all fine. And so, like, just having a lot of both ands in terms of ways for people to access help. That's really what I was referencing when I was talking about, you know, just depending on where someone has come from, what their experience has been, either here locally, here in the United States, or in other countries. They just may have varying levels of trust with the systematic way we approach things. I don't know if anybody else wants to add anything on that.
No, I think, Liz, I think that is a great way to say, I think but not necessarily just for like the sheriff's office and the EOC, but I think it goes full circle here for any organization of that need to be able to adjust so that we can better meet the clients. And I think that's I think it's not just one avenue. I think it's for everybody, whether it's a local community resources to a county resource, state resource, of, you know, having that ability to do whatever it takes to meet those client needs at that moment. And so I think that's a great way to look at it, that ability to adjust. I like that.
Great. And we also had a question about whether unhoused community member representatives are welcome to join future discussions. And so I think certainly from the Community Foundation's point of view, absolutely. I just want to open it up to the group to see if there are any particulars that you want to add in terms of accessibility, outreach, those kinds of things.
You know, I was part of a conversation yesterday about a county that's thinking about using their American Rescue Plan dollars to address homelessness. And this comment came up of, when we think about people who are unhoused, or people who are housing insecure, or people who are experiencing homelessness, we think we know what that means. And so I'm hoping, yes, I mean, absolutely. I think that having those voices would be so significant for us to better understand, like, how we even go about planning and trying to meet the needs of a population that we think we've drawn a box around them, but their box may be different than what we think, like how they self-identify, how they would describe their own situation. I think will be critical for us in, you know, planning and determining where investments get made and what would be helpful. Because I have an adult son who spent a year and a half couch surfing, sometimes living in his car. And if you had asked him in month 1 of that, whether he was experiencing homelessness. His answer was no, because he was fine. And in month 18, he was willing to say he was housing insecure, but he was really still fine. And I just would think, I don't even know the language to use. And I learned a lot from that personal experience. And I think we could all learn more by having people who are differently housed or unhoused be a part of our conversations.
We have several questions that are really best answered by government entities, whether they're around FEMA or city and county decision-making processes, et cetera. So I just want to make sure that we're clear that we're not going to try to step into that lane and represent anything, but we will get those questions to the right people, and then we will follow up with the responses so that we can get you the best information available. There's also a question about how this group could possibly influence builders and developers to create affordable multifamily housing in our agricultural community in the North County. So there's certainly lots to say there, but anybody that wants to chime in would be great.
I mean, I think definitely is a need. It is a need for a lot of our families that work in agriculture. I mean, north of Bellingham is an expansion for agriculture workers, and so these families are out there. They're trying to meet our needs, right, by providing food for us, and yet, they are limitless as far as housing opportunities and financially, how to afford housing. It's another issue. So I think it'd be amazing if we could connect with agencies and other, developers to think of I brought this up many times. What can we do for our migrant housing and our migrant families and our agricultural families that are out here working day to day, long hours, and I know that there's a limited amount of farm worker housing, but that also ties families to that farm worker. I grew up as a migrant worker myself, and so I know what it's like to work for a farmer. And so I think for our families, just having some of that available to them, more of that available to them. And I think, with how Everson Meadows is going right now, which is the only migrant housing in Everson, that's going to go away, I think, in the future. And so then they're left with nothing that they could qualify for. So yes, definitely. I'm not sure how to advocate for that, but if I need to, count me in, I'm willing.
So I'll have to jump in here. Being a vice president in a large organization whose sister agency, which is Catholic Housing Services, has been one of the major developers of farm worker housing in Western Washington, I think that this entity and all the folks that are listening in could take this opportunity to talk with local government about the profound need for farm worker housing in North Whatcom County, and come up with a plan to approach Catholic Housing Services to entertain the state in the next round of that Commerce puts out around low-income housing tax credit partnership programs to develop agricultural worker housing in North County. We had a project in Everson slated a bunch of years ago.
Yep, I remember.
It was like to the 10-yard line and we couldn't get it across the goal line. And I think we need to breathe some new life into that. But the core of it is not CCS or CHS, it's local government, because you have to have local resources to the tune of a couple $2 million to come forward to then match the state money, and then we go get the Fed money. So if we could create a coalition to honestly bring this forward, I'll be the champion within my organization to make that move.
Yay.
We'll be standing with you.
Yep, right behind you, Will.
Great, thank you, Will. And there are lots of efforts just to kind of put a bow on the housing issue. There are not only organizations in the nonprofit sector like CCS and others have been in that space for a number of years. And yet now, I think as most people know, it's gotten to a crisis point where the business community is talking about it because it is also affecting broader employment. And so there are lots of conversations around access to capital, around where housing is needed, what type of housing is needed. And I think as has been encouraged, just continue to stay connected, stay informed, and those relationships, making sure that the voices that need to be heard are at all of those various tables is really important. We also had a question about a rainy day fund for disasters and whether there is any movement by the city or cities or county government to create one. And I have not heard anything about, again, city or county, which we will follow up on. But I do want to highlight for folks that thanks to significant amount of effort on the part of our local Small Business Development Center and the Port of Bellingham, that the reason that there is some funding available from the state for businesses that were affected by the flood, that only happened because there was a lot of information pulled together and a case was able to be made to the legislature. So we're very fortunate that there was $20 million set aside in the last budget, and 10 of that was specifically designated for Northwest Washington, not exclusively for Whatcom County, but clearly as the county that had the most significant impacts related to the flood, it's likely a large portion of that will be coming this way to businesses that were affected. So we have just a couple minutes left before we promised to return you to your normal worlds. And so I just want to give you an option. You can have probably about 30 seconds to respond either to what's giving you hope or any other comments you want to make about the role of trust in this kind of incredibly important work. And let's see, Lacey, can we start with you?
Yeah, what's given me hope? You know, I started as a volunteer, a community member at the very beginning, just helping out the community. And what gives me hope is that this community is near to my heart. And so continuing to help those that need it. That is what gives me hope and keeps me doing this now as a job. It's what keeps me going, is to help the people and to see so many people that are stepping up to help those as different community partners are coming together to collaborate just to meet the needs of all the individuals that we possibly can.
Thank you. Will, how about you?
Sure. You know, I think Whatcom County is a really special place. And I'm fortunate enough to work in other Northwest Washington counties, and they all have their own little specialness, but there's something about Whatcom County and the way the agencies that are here to help work together. And to me, that gives me great hope. And because Whatcom County is actually, it's a diverse county, and not just people and ethnically and racially, but just our communities are very different. You know, Linden's very different than Fairhaven. You know, but we work together, and we join together when things are needed. And the hope I have is that we'll get better at responding to crisis, because we've gotten a bit of practice now. And I think over these last, you know, starting with the beginning of COVID, we know each other better now. There's a comfort, and I think it all comes down to trust. And I think getting some of that trust permeated into more places that I think the agencies have with each other, I think the more we can kind of spread that trust, the better off we'll be. And so I'm hopeful because I do believe Whatcom is a special place.
Great. Liz?
Whereas I was actually thinking about the first time that you and I met, and I think you had been part of a group of people that had gone to the Equity Summit from Whatcom County many years ago.
Yeah.
And, the thing that gives me hope, this growing demand to recognize everyone in our community, to find ways to advance equity so that everyone feels like they're living in a community where they belong, they're nurtured. And, every time a new person kind of has that epiphany, I have hope for the future. And seeing that become a part of the conversation around the flood response is what kept me coming back to the table. It wasn't about, ironically, it wasn't about FEMA and it wasn't about shelters. It was really, can we actually see the people in our community and see them as us? That's what gave me hope. That's what I hope for in the future.
Sylvia, I'm giving you your wish. You get to go last.
Yay.
Thanks, Mauri. I think for me, what gives me hope is is, as an advocate for our little community of Nooksack, Everson, Nooksack, Sumas, and working with the Latino population in particular, right? As a support person and as a liaison, what gives me hope is that I have learned so much through this last 6 months, so much in connection, in relationship building and networking, all for the hope of advocating in a different way, in a different, in different moments and connections to those families. And so the families give me hope. The prosperity of our county gives me hope. Having this conversation with Will when he said about, access to more housing gives me hope. So all these things in connection and just appreciating having these moments of connections with everyone here, in this panel, and knowing that we're here for the same reason and the same purpose, is that we want hope for our community. That gives me hope and satisfaction. Thank you so much.
That's great. Well, I'll take a quick moderator's privilege and say that what gives me hope is that I think that we're not only trainable, but we're also filled, to touch back on Will's comment about it being a special community. I think there's a lot of curiosity and a lot of desire to figure out how we can do better, and then to work together to do that, to not let blaming get in the way, not let other distractions intervene, but that we really just need to stay focused on the people in this community and how we can better function as a bunch of neighbors in one place. So again, cannot thank you all enough for the incredible insights, for all of your work, for having been on phone calls in the wee hours at both ends of the day, because I know that's been true for all of you. And we will again follow up on the questions that we weren't able to get to. And please look for a survey. We would really love your feedback about the format of these briefings. Are they helpful? What would you like to see more of? And please do revisit that list of the things that you can do going forward, because you can play a critical role in all different kinds of ways to make sure that we help the folks that are still recovering from the flood and also be better prepared as a community. So thanks again, everyone, for joining us. We'll see you soon.